Hey, this is a response to Mormonism with the Murphs video from about a month ago called, Could God Have Commanded Joseph to Restore Polygamy? Murph, I thought you raised some really interesting questions, and I've heard these thoughts a lot, and so I thought rather than try to answer every single thing in the comment section, I would just make my own response video. So I want to talk about why I focus on polygamy and not murder and genocide in the Old Testament. And it's kind of simple. We don't teach or believe that genocide or even justified killing is the new and everlasting covenant. I've never heard that teaching before. Nobody is saying, no man has ever told me that the highest and holiest form of life in the celestial kingdom is eternal genocide and murder. And I don't understand it now, but someday it'll all be clear and it'll all make sense and it'll be beautiful. No one's ever said that. But I absolutely have heard that argument, and I have been testified to that that is the case with polygamy. So right off the bat, I think it's a false equivalency because nobody believes that genocide, murder, justified killing is godly and part of the celestial realm. But we absolutely have, whether it's a theological belief or a cultural belief or both, this determination that polygamy is absolutely part of the celestial kingdom, that it comes from God. So that right off the bat is why it's so important to me to be able to understand whether that's true or not, because that affects my divine destiny. Even just in our own church history, no one looks back at Mountain Meadows Massacre and says, well, God commanded it. It's hard to understand, but the mysteries of God, what can we do? No, setting aside the responsibility of why the men thought that they were justified in those killings, we acknowledge that the Mountain Meadows Massacre was wrong. And no one is saying that God commanded the Mountain Meadows Massacre, despite the very strong rhetoric in the Journal of Discourses that gives a pretty clear impression that the leaders at that time taught that there were times when God justified genocide. So I think it's just a false equivalency on every level. Looking at the specific case of Nephi killing Laban, I got out my scriptures and I was starting to go through and think about if you look at this verse and that verse, as I looked through it, I was like, you know what, you're not asking for me to explain it. You're not asking for a new interpretation of it. You know that there are various interpretations. You know that some people through one lens can say that Nephi was breaking the law of Moses, but through another lens, there is definitely a case to be made that Laban was the one who broke the law of Moses, and that was the just punishment for what he did. But as it relates to polygamy, what I want to point out is that every reading and interpretation of Nephi slaying Laban acknowledges that this is a situation that was unfortunately required because of fallen world conditions and sin. Nobody is making the argument that slaying Laban, that murder or justified killing is God's higher way. Only that God used this to accomplish God's higher purposes. So if this is what we actually believed and taught about polygamy, that it was just a command to raise up seed or something like that, I think that it actually could have made it through all the way undetected. So I wrote a paper on this called An Enemy Hath Done This, The Seed and Weeds of Polygamy, because I believe that polygamy is one of those doctrines or traditions that, depending on the culture or the era, could seem like, maybe it was commanded by God or God allowed it in a positive sense. But eventually it is revealed to be a deadly counterfeit. And one feature of polygamy that I think reveals its true nature is that it cannot be bridled. If it was just levirate marriage, or if it was just commanded to raise up seed, then again, it would be possible that we wouldn't have been able to see its true nature. But that has never been the case with polygamy. There's no scriptural example of polygamy working under any justification or law. And now we also have groundbreaking sociological studies that witness to this as well, that there is no good fruit from polygamy. So I kind of want to reframe the question that you were asking. You were saying, if I believe that there's no way God would ever command polygamy, then how do I explain? And I want to reframe it because I'm not saying there's no way God ever could. I'm saying I don't see any evidence that God ever has. And when I look back at our church history at the time when we say it was commanded, my question is, How could the saints have known that that command was from God? I'm putting on the screen the law of the church, which was given in 1831 in the presence of 12 elders and accepted by the saints as the law. Verse 22, thou shalt love thy wife with all thy heart, and shalt cleave unto her, and none else. And then just a few months later, this revelation, section 49, where the Lord says, verse 15, marriage is ordained of God unto man, wherefore it is lawful that he should have one wife, and they twain shall be one flesh, and all this that the earth might answer the end of its creation. And then when the Doctrine and Covenants was published, it included a separate statement on marriage, specifically disavowing polygamy. We declare that we believe that one man should have one wife, and one woman but one husband, except in case of death, when either is at liberty to marry again. And then these revelations and statements were presented to the church and were accepted and acknowledged as the doctrine and covenants of their faith by a unanimous vote. This was the law. So my question, and no one has been able to answer this for me, is if this was the law of the church, how could a teenage girl or a married woman in the early church figure out if it actually was God who commanded polygamy? Are prophets above the law? And are they allowed to invite us to secretly engage in behavior which is expressly forbidden by the law? If a man in authority tells us that he has received a commandment from God that is in direct contradiction to the law of the church, but we feel like he's telling the truth, are we supposed to just go with that? Doesn't that make men and our feelings into God? The thing about Section 132 is that when it eventually and without common consent was added to the Doctrine and Covenants, it really had come out of nowhere theologically. I mean, you look at the Revelations and the law, and you can see that God's been very consistent. And there's an absolute clarity and a through line of truth that's been throughout the scriptures. You can use one lens to read the scriptures in a way that defends polygamy and makes it part of the gospel. You can also choose to direct your faith toward an interpretation that polygamy is an abomination, as the Book of Mormon says it is. And as you nourish that faith and view the scriptures through that lens, that, I believe, becomes a Urim and Thummim. That understanding of God's law of marriage informs how you view women. It informs your understanding of the nature of God. So personally, it was in my best interest for my own spiritual progression and growth and relationship with God and my husband to find out if polygamy was of God. And now with the understanding that I have that it's not of God, my next question when I examine church history is, how much do I want to accuse Joseph of this abomination? And when I looked at the evidence and I looked at what he said, what he taught publicly, what he wrote privately, what he had published in his name while he was alive, what he had published directly addressing what later becomes Section 132, when he says that they took the truth of God and transformed it into a lie, I thought, wow, I shrink to accuse him of this. Brigham is a different person. He has a different situation. He never claimed to have seen God. He never claimed to have been ministered to by angels. So he's going to be held to account for this in a different way than Joseph would. And I'm not saying that Joseph couldn't have. I only am saying that I will not stand as one of his accusers because he said he didn't. I do feel like that's a secondary issue to the larger question of, is polygamy of God? And if polygamy is not of God and never has been of God, then we've got some stuff to work through as a church, but we can. Part of why I think this is coming to a head is because we're really coming into a decision point. If we want to build a Zion people, is polygamy part of that? We should know. In fact, we have to know. We can't build a Zion people with this wishy-washy, maybe yes, maybe no. We have to know that it either is or isn't. We have to either accept that it is or accept that it isn't. And I think generally women are kind of like, oh, it is, and we don't like to think about it, and someday we'll understand. But I have been just amazed and so grateful to learn through my faith that it's not. And you can scripturally defend that it's not. and you can sociologically defend that it's not. And all the questions that we have about it do have answers, and God will give us those answers if we truly are willing to embrace truth. It requires us to let go of some of our traditions, and that can be really hard, but the fruits are worth it. And so isn't murder worse than polygamy? I would say child sacrifice is worse than polygamy, and you can see scripturally how the Lord takes a very strong stance about that and works with people from there. But polygamy is spiritual murder to women's hearts. Jacob 2 talks about that. Jacob chapters 1 through 3 actually talk about that it pierces the hearts of women and children with deep wounds, and many die. And that has been true throughout time. And that's one of the many reasons why it's not part of the order of God. The order of God is matrimony, which is a divine balance of masculine and feminine that was started at the creation, as Christ said, "Have you not read, in the beginning, God made them male and female." I hope that answered the questions, and I hope that that was a fair representation of this perspective. And let me know if you have any others.